Welcome to a special edition of the Family Pulpit Podcast, also known as Notes from the Pulpit, where we take a deeper dive into theological and cultural issues, generally based on the main show. In this episode, I want to build off the introduction to work from episode 3 of the main FPP podcast by looking at two key concepts that we discussed there. The first is Adam as a king priest, and then relatedly, the garden as a garden temple. To do this, I want to read and review several theological works to help us flesh out this idea and also root this concept a little deeper than what we were able to in the main show. First up is a commentary on Genesis written by John Walton. Now, Walton is an Old Testament scholar, and he's a professor emeritus at Wheaton College. I think at least he still is. He's best known for kind of interpreting Genesis from an ancient Near Eastern, or what's called, you might see abbreviated as ANE, that cultural context. And he's going to emphasize functional ontology rather than material origin. So if you had listened to our episode 1 on origins, primarily Walton's going to come from a theistic evolution background and perspective as a framework for his interpretation. So it's a reasonable commentary. He does have some things that you may want to watch out for and push back on, like most books. But I think that this section that he where he talks about from Genesis 2 on the garden temple is at least going to be helpful for us today. So I'm going to just read a little excerpt from his commentary, maybe discuss and interact with it as we go along here. We'll see. This, by the way, if you have this commentary, it is, a Zondervan publication, and it's based on the NIV. This whole series from Zondervan, both Old Testament and New Testament, is a very well-written commentary set, very well done. The ones that I have had, or at least had my hands on at one point or another, the authors of them have been just solid overall. I'm not a huge fan of the NIV per se, but they're gonna kind of use that as their basis. But you really could plug and play this commentary on top of any other faithful Bible translation. So in his commentary, we are on page 172. Let me just read and highlight a few things here. So the heading is a bold heading. It's called Work and Care, and he's going to note Genesis 2:15. Where the role of Adam is identified. God puts him in the garden to work it and take care of it. You might remember from episode 3 where we highlighted this phrase particularly because it points out and points towards Adam as a priestly role, priestly function. And I think we even looked at or showed some verses on a screen, Numbers 3 and Numbers 18, and there's at least 4 or 5 others that use this phrase, work it and keep it, in conjunction with priestly activities. So Walton goes on, and he says that a semantic study of these words, the verbs, and I won't read the Hebrew here, but the verbs work and then also to take care of are terms most frequently encountered in discussions of human service to God rather than descriptions of agricultural tasks. Now remember, if you listen to that prior episode, we kind of talked about how these functions can point towards, or at least the work, I should say, can point towards the land or ground, but can also point towards God. So in other words, the word can mean work or to serve, minister, or worship. But here, Walton's going to highlight that when they're held together, they don't always point specifically to the ground, but may also have a priestly function. He says the verb, which is work, can refer to farming activity, which is used in Genesis 2:5 and 3:23, which we talked about. But in those contexts, the nuance of the verb is conditioned by the direct object, the ground, which we also talked about. Most likely the context was pointing towards the ground, but the word can also be used as a reference to worship God, and that's what he's highlighting here. A broader sense of the word is often connected to religious service deemed as worship, for example, Exodus 3:12, or a priestly functionary serving in the sanctuary precinct, for example, Numbers 3:7 through 10, which we talked about in our last show. In these cases, the object of the verb usually refers to what or whom is being worshipped. And there's a couple other examples here. Exodus 4:23, 23:33. So, what he ends up highlighting here is saying we got a little bit of an issue. Is this work talking about the ground, or is it talking about a priestly concept and priestly function? So after he wrestles through this a little bit, he concludes one, that it could be both, but that the general task that's given to Adam is most likely that of a priestly nature, that he's caring for a sacred space, and it's that sacred space we also want to highlight as a garden temple, or maybe more accurately, we might say a temple with a garden attached to it. So if you're thinking kind of like a palace where a king would have a garden adjacent to it, a lot of times they had temples with gardens adjacent to it as well. I think, I may be wrong here, but I think one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world in Babylon, those gardens were adjacent to a temple, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, that's a similar concept that we're talking about here. So, in ancient thinking, quoting Walton here, in ancient thinking, caring for sacred space was a way of upholding creation. By preserving order, chaos was held at bay. So, Walton here is picking up right on those same concepts that we talked about in episode 3, where Adam has this priestly type function. The garden's going to more or less serve as a garden temple. We'll hit on this in a few of the other references that I use here. He continues here, just finishing up with him on page 174. If the priestly vocabulary in 215 indicates the same kind of thinking here, the point of caring for sacred space should be seen as much more than landscaping or even priestly duties. Maintaining order made one a participant with God in the ongoing task of sustaining the equilibrium God had established in the cosmos. In other words, I would argue that by Adam functioning as a gardener, as a priest, as a reflection of the image of God, God is actually Adam is actually serving alongside God in the execution of dominion, dynasty, subduing the earth. So God is essentially, what I'm driving at here is that God has made Adam his vice regent over the creation, his representative. And in those aspects, he's serving as a gardener, he's serving as a priest, and he's serving alongside God. And if you think this isn't too difficult to understand, as God gave Adam and Eve the charge to be fruitful and multiply. And if you just back up for a second, you can understand that man and woman, husband and wife, they actually create a child. Now, they don't create ex nihilo or out of nothing like God does, but they most certainly create after the pattern of the Creator. So in other words, God has given Adam the functions of creating. It's kind of sharing those attributes that he had. We might say those are communicable attributes, that of creation. Again, not out of nothing, but at least that desire and ability has been planted in his heart. So that's Walton. I think that's a relatively helpful addition to what we talked about. Next up, just bear with me as I grab his book. But next up, this is actually an excellent book. This is one of my favorite books on the Old Testament. It's called Dominion and Dynasty, A Theology of the Hebrew Bible, and it's written by Stephen G. Dempster. Dempster is a Canadian biblical theologian. I think he may still be a professor at Crandall University, not sure. But he writes this from a kind of a reformed evangelical perspective, and he goes through an overview of Genesis throughout the Old Testament. Let's see here. Yeah, he's going to walk through each section of the Old Testament. Again, it's very well written. But I just wanted to point out he may have a sentence or two. It's going to help us here. This book, by the way, this is another excellent series. This comes from New Studies in Biblical Theology, and you'll be able to identify this series by their gray cover. They all have a distinct gray cover, usually a smallish picture of some sort on there with the typeset title. It's published by InterVarsity Press and maybe Apollos also. So in that book on page 64, this is what Dempster has to say. Okay, so let's see here. The Adam, or the man, we might say, the Adam is to serve the Adama. That's the ground. So there was an inherent relationship between the name of man and the name of ground. They were linked together. And that makes sense because God created man out of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So the two have an innate relationship from the beginning. But the Adam is to serve the Adama and the garden into which he has been placed, and to look after it, which probably means to develop by cultivating as a farmer. Now see, we're holding together these two ideas. We might even say one the physical and one the spiritual, and combining them together in order to avoid Gnosticism. We know that work and worship were combined. His work in the garden also points towards God, which is his worship. Continuing on with Dempster, also given the symbolism of the garden and its relationship to the later sanctuary and temple, as noted above, it is interesting to note that this language is often used with respect to the task of priests and Levites in fulfilling their respective responsibilities. And he cites here Numbers 3:7-8. So Dempster is looking at our verse that we already talked about, Genesis 2:15, to work it and keep it, and he's seeing again the same parallel relationship and how it points to Adam being a priest in this garden temple. There's another task. Man is to enjoy all the trees in the garden except one, a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and to eat of it would certainly mean death. Let's see here. I think that is all that I want to point out from Dempster. Oh, there's another note on page 62 here. The geographical aspect is limited to the garden. So you remember from episode 3 where I said that as Adam was given commissions and work, that there were guardrails to that. It was confined to the garden. There was anticipation that it would spread to the world. But for that probationary period, it was confined to the garden. Dempster here says that the place will become a prime habitat for the human couple. It's a garden that's planted by the Lord. This term plant is a rich theological term used to describe something that God produces to give life to and to nourish its surroundings. And then he kind of walks through these same type of observations that we've already made and that we will highlight more a little bit in depth later. There's another book that brings these out more clearly about the garden. But that's Dempster. Helpful. Very good book. Very good series. I've got maybe 8 or 10 from this series. I've yet to find one that's bad. There was one, I'm not actually going to tell you the name of it, throw you under the bus. It was kind of written on the book of Hebrews. I think it's a reasonably helpful book, but the author got in a little bit of trouble because he was accused of plagiarism. I don't know that throws his whole work out because I don't think he copied word for word. I think he just failed to properly make citations or footnotes. So, whatever. Okay, next up here is, now this book, I don't know, it's got a couple sections in the beginning that I just skimmed over. Sometimes I do that with books. I don't know, it's helpful, but it's T. Desmond Alexander, and the first book is From Paradise to the Promised Land. These first sections have to do with the documentary hypothesis theory. If you're not familiar with that, you may want to look it up. I mean, it is helpful to know, maybe if you're talking about ancient Near Eastern literature and some of the arguments that go into who wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So there's a whole lot of biblical criticism that kind of came up in the late 1800s from the Germans who brought all of this JDP documentary hypotheses. But anyway, if you get the book, you can skip over that and you're still going to get decent amount of helpful information. So his book is published by Baker Academic. It is a little bit academic, it is a little bit heady, but here's the section that we're interested in, and it's on page 124. Dempster writes, another fascinating pointer to the Garden of Eden as being part of a divine sanctuary may be seen in the duties that God gives man in Genesis 2:15. The man's responsibilities in the garden are encapsulated by using 2 verbs, and those are the ones that are to serve, to work, which is also to till. We didn't talk about that. And then the second set of verbs, to keep, to observe, or to guard. Now, to guard, we didn't talk about either, and we probably should have. We may do that in the next episode. When used independently of one another, these verbs can refer to a wide range of activities. However, when used together, they tend to be linked to activities associated with the tabernacle or temple. Sorry about that. The book of Numbers uses them in tandem to describe the duties of the Levites in the sanctuary. And that was, again, the Numbers 3:7-8, Numbers 8:26, Numbers 18:5-6. This strongly suggests that the man's work is priestly in nature rather than agricultural. And I would also point out, I wouldn't want to necessarily separate those two. I wouldn't want to just say, well, Adam's activities are to be nothing but spiritual as he worships in the garden, and that the work wasn't going to be left behind. I don't think so. I think work and worship were to be intertwined at this point in time, pre-fall, we might add. Quoting Dempster again, the man is appointed first and foremost as a guardian of sacred space. He was not created simply to be a gardener. I would agree with that. Not simply a gardener. Combine the two together. The overall picture in Genesis 1-2 suggests the creation of the earth is closely associated with the construction of God's temple, although this is merely the start of the process, not its completion. In this context, humans are created not only to serve within this temple, but also to extend its boundaries outward so that it fills the whole earth, like I was saying earlier. Dempster again. Alexander again, I apologize. To enable them to do this, they are given royal authority alongside their priestly status. In other words, Adam would not simply have been a priest, but a king priest. And I would argue that once God gives him the commands to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as well as the commissions that we talked about in episode 3, that he also now has a prophetic function, first to his wife, and then to his posterity, which, as we know, he didn't get a chance to do in the garden context because of the fall in Genesis 3. Okay, so Dempster, he does kind of highlight here, I think he's going to do this more so in the next book of his I'm going to quote, so I won't read through all of this, but he does make a reasonable argument for the parallels between Eden and the later Israelite sanctuaries. Also, in particular, the tabernacle and Jerusalem temple. I'll just read the highlights here without going in depth. But the Lord walks in Eden, as he does in the tabernacle. Eden and later sanctuaries are entered from the east and guarded by a cherubim. The tabernacle menorah, or the lampstand, possibly symbolizes the tree of life. Go either way you want with that. The river flowing from Eden in Genesis 2:10 resembles Ezekiel 47, which envisages a river flowing from the future Jerusalem temple and bringing life to the Dead Sea, which you would find in Revelation 21 and 22. And the golden onyx mentioned in Genesis 2:11-12 is used extensively to decorate the latter sanctuary and priestly garments. Gold in particular is associated with the divine presence. So, there we go. We're building the argument, just providing you with some theological resources that Adam's role in the garden, work and worship combined, was priestly in nature, and that the garden wasn't simply a garden, but was a garden temple. And Adam then would have the role of a priest, which now we've added to that a king priest and also a prophetic function. So, next up. We're halfway there. Next up, and by the way, I would wholeheartedly recommend each one of these resources, though, again, read through, look out for maybe some bones that you might encounter along the way, but there's a lot of meat in there, a lot of meat to hold on to. The next guy that I'm going to read, I actually really, really like him. Some people are torn on him. Some people discard him altogether. I don't want to do that. I think the difficulty is because Baptists, specifically, sorry about that, Reformed Baptists like to gravitate towards him, and Paedo-Baptists don't really like that because he himself was a Paedo-Baptist. But it's Meredith Kline, and his book Kingdom Prologue is dense. It is rich and dense. It's very good. I don't know if you necessarily would read it straight through. You could. I don't think that I've read it cover to cover. I think what I've done is I've gone in and looked for various topics and subjects that I wanted to see what Kline had to say on those. So Meredith Kline, he's a Reformed theologian. He's an Old Testament scholar. He was originally at Westminster Theological Seminary and then moved on, I think, to Gordon Conwell. He's going to emphasize a covenant structure of redemptive history, which is helpful. And he's also got a section on here, which as I'm talking, reminded me that he has an entire section where he deals with dispensationalism. And let's see if I can find, I don't have it marked, but I just didn't know if I could run into it real quick, because I thought it was a standalone towards the end. No, I don't see it. This particular publication, I don't really like this publication all that much. It's by Two Age Press. I think it could have been formatted a little bit better. It's a little bit, little clunky maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm being hypercritical here. I'm not sure. But anyway, Page that we're interested in is page 86. And let's see here. Oh, yeah, I remember what Klein points out here. It is good. I'm going back up to page 85. The Creator had prepared in Eden an earthly replica of his heavenly dwelling as the holy place, where man would fulfill his priestly office. So he's jumping right out of the gate into exactly what we're talking about. In the compact report given in Genesis 2:15 of man's obligations with respect to his garden world, a specifically cultic, and by that cultic just means worship, a specifically cultic as well as cultural assignment is included. That's what I was hitting on. The work, which is the cultic, and the worship. I got that backwards. I apologize. The work, which is the cultural, and the worship, which is the cultic. Sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once here. Quoting Klein again. In addition to tilling or cultivating, the garden man was to guard it. Now that we probably could have hit on more because the translation of work it and keep it, yes, that's true. We don't really understand what that means. So, like, keep it what? Like, close to this vest? Sorta. In guarding it. So there was a guarding function that he was giving. So he has to work the ground, but he also has to guard it. And then when those two words are held together thematically, it's a priestly type function or duty. So Adam had the idea of, or the command or commission to guard this garden space, which, by the way, he failed to do as the serpent comes in and addresses his wife. And then as we know, he tempts her and she eats, and the rest is history. Going back to Klein, he says he was to protect the Edenic sanctuary from profanation. Such priestly guardianship of the holy presence is a basic function of sanctuary service, a negative kind of consecration. The cultic force of the verb guard in Genesis 2:15 is indicated by the use of the same verb, shamar is the verb, in Genesis 3:24 for the task of protecting the sanctity of the garden when the assignment was taken from man and transferred to others. Now, I didn't hit on this. I think we will talk about this in episode 4, a follow-up to work, but this is big because the work and worship that were combined in Genesis 2:15 are then separated because of sin, and the guarding function is given to the angel and taken away from the man because he failed. And I think that the only way that those two are combined back together, work and worship, is by faith. And Abel is the key example of that. Not Cain, but Abel. Let's see what else Klein has to say. In fact, in the narrative of the expulsion of man from the garden after the fall, both elements of man's commissioning mentioned in Genesis 2:15 are taken up, with the same terms used there for both of them employed again. Thus, fallen man was to continue to, quote, till the ground or work it, in Genesis 3:23, though now outside the garden. Were it not for this interpretive echo of the verb in Genesis 2:15, the latter might be understood in the cultic sense, which it sometimes has. An example, Numbers 3:7. However, man was no longer to guard the garden. The responsibility to guard the way to the tree of life was given to the cherubim with the flaming sword in Genesis 3:24. Here, shamar, that's the verb again, to guard, unmistakably signifies the maintenance of the sanctity of the garden, and the value of the appeal to the use of shamar in this passage is all the greater if the suggestion is valid that the narrative of Genesis 2:4 to 3:24 is chiastically arranged. That means it's the Greek letter chi or chi, and it's an X. So if you think of an X-type shape, sometimes the authors would use a chiastic form in order to highlight or make a specific point noticeable. And so Klein is just simply pointing out that there could be this arrangement in Genesis 2:4 to Genesis 3:24, in which the peak of that would be Genesis 2:15 and 3:24 coming together to correspond to end members of the structure. So I know that might sound complicated for you. I can maybe mention it in episode 4. Maybe I can do a little helpful note or drawing that I can include in the note somewhere. Let's see. So he's going to highlight what we just talked about, how these priestly ideas, priestly concepts with these verbs show up throughout the Old Testament. Quoting Klein again, The conclusion appears warranted, therefore, that Genesis 2:15 contains an explicit reference to the entrusting of man in his priestly office with the task of defending the Edenic sanctuary against the intrusion of anything that would be alien to the holiness of God, of the garden, or hostile to his name, which, of course, the serpent was. Okay. Man, Klein's rich. Klein is rich. You guys that don't like him, I don't know why. Don't be hating on him. It's good. There's not everything that I agree with, and some things he comes from a different perspective than I would take, but it's still very helpful. Okay, 2 left. Next up is, again, T. Desmond Alexander, and in this book, it's called From Eden to the New Jerusalem, way shorter than the other one, way more compact. Doesn't mean it's any less rich or dense, because it is, but this is subtitled An Introduction to Biblical Theology, and I think this is a helpful book as well. Let's see. I've got marked here. I'm not going to read this, but the entire chapter 2 is basically this concept that we've been talking about. And this book is published by Kregel Academic. Some of their stuff can be expensive, but this one's paperback, not too bad. Let's see here. Chapter 2. Let's find out where this starts at. Chapter 2 begins on page 13 of this particular book, entitled From Sacred Garden to Holy City, Experiencing the Presence of God. Okay, he's actually going to begin this chapter by citing Revelation 21, verses 1 to 3. And I think that he's going to do that in order to provide the framework for where he wants to go to see this relationship of the garden in Eden to this garden of the new creation from Revelation 21. So the whole chapter is rich. Let's see here. Makes his comparison, makes his arguments that Genesis is a garden temple. Jesus as God's tabernacle among humans, which is another excellent point. He's got the motif of a temple, which, by the way, is a huge theme throughout all of Scripture, where God promises to dwell among his people. You'll see that in the Old Testament language a lot, where God wants to make his tabernacle among his people, specifically as they come to dwell in the new land, or in the promised land, I should say. And then John, in his gospel, said that Jesus comes and tabernacles among us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacles among us. So it's pulling together all of these themes of tabernacle, temple that were promised from the Old Testament, which find their fulfillment in Christ. Then, as the new heavens and new earth are created, in Revelation 20, 21, and 22, we see it again, this idea of a temple or tabernacle. So, Alexander's going through that. Here it is on page 20. We've got the temple garden of Eden. Okay, having observed that the New Jerusalem is a gigantic temple city in which God lives, it is noteworthy that the Garden of Eden is portrayed in the opening chapters of Genesis as a divine sanctuary. And he's going to quote Gordon Wenham here, which I'm familiar with, but I don't think I have his any of his commentaries. I don't believe. But anyway, citing Wenham. The Garden of Eden is not viewed by the author of Genesis simply as a piece of Mesopotamian farmland, but as an archetypal sanctuary. That is, a place where God dwells and where man should worship him. Again, tying together work and worship. Many of the features of the garden may also be found in later sanctuaries, particularly the tabernacle or Jerusalem temple. These parallels suggest that the garden itself is understood as a sort of sanctuary. Then, citing Alexander again, while Wenham views the garden as a sort of sanctuary, quotes, it may be more accurate to designate it as a temple garden, adopting John Walton's suggestion that the garden is attached to Eden, with Eden itself being the temple. That's what I was getting at, and that's probably more accurate. That Eden itself is the temple, Eden itself is the place where God dwells, and that this garden is adjacent to that temple, which is mind-blowing. If you just give yourself a meditation on that for a minute, read Genesis and meditate on that fact that God was establishing his temple on earth in this garden. And of course, we know that man sinned, was kicked out of the garden, but then we're always moving back to that idea, right? The promised land, the place where God was going to dwell with his people. the temple that David built, which actually was Solomon's temple, and God's Shekinah comes in there. But then because of sin, once again, the Shekinah goes over the hill in Ezekiel. And then the promise of the temple to come again, now in the form of Christ. And then holding out this promise of a temple in the new heavens and new earth. Mind-blowing, fascinating. The case for, reading Alexander again here on page 21, the case for Eden being a divine residence rests largely on the striking parallels that exist between the garden and later Israelite sanctuaries. Wenham helpfully lists the main similarities between the Garden of Eden and the Tabernacle and/or Jerusalem Temple. 1. Eden and the later sanctuaries were entered from the east, which we talked about before. Actually, this might be a repetition of what we just read from Alexander. Let me see here. Not verbatim. The words that we've been talking about with work it and keep it, those Hebrew verbs, which he has noted here, are to serve or to till, which we already talked about, and then to keep, observe, or guard, used in God's command to the man to work it, the garden, and to take care of it, from Genesis 2:15, are found in combination elsewhere in the Pentateuch, only in passages that describe the duties of the Levites in the sanctuary. And he highlights our Numbers passages again. See, it wasn't something I made up. It is fascinating what God did here. And then he goes on, Alexander goes on, he cites Walton again. And let's see here. He's going to pick up in page 26. This is where I want to end with Alexander before we get to our last reference. In Genesis 2:15, the man is divinely commissioned to work and keep the garden. Interestingly, the verb keep in Hebrew, which he spells as samar, but shamar, as we saw earlier, may also be translated guard or protect. In Deuteronomy 5:12, the same verb is used to instruct the Israelites to keep or guard the sanctity of the Sabbath. In all likelihood, Adam was commissioned to keep or guard the garden so that it would remain holy. This was a normal task associated with any sanctuary. However, by siding with the serpent, the human couple fail in their priestly duty. Beale, that's G.K. Beale, who's also going to be our last reference I'll read in a minute, puts it like this. When Adam failed to guard the temple by sinning and letting in a foul serpent to defile the sanctuary, he lost his priestly role, and the cherubim took over the responsibility of guarding the garden temple. God stationed the cherubim to guard the way to the tree of life. So also in Genesis 3:24, see also Ezekiel 28, verse 14 and 16. Alexander cites, I'm not familiar with Richard Middleton, but he cites him. While Adam is placed in the garden to till/work and keep it, the cherubim are placed at the east of the garden to guard the way of the tree of life. When Adam is expelled from the garden, all that is left to do is to till or work the ground. The task of keeping or guarding the garden has been passed on to others. This is exactly what I've been talking about. The work and worship were combined in the garden as Adam's priestly duties. He was not only charged to till the land, that is to work it, but he's also charged to guard the land, guard that garden area, which was his priestly function. After he sinned, those tasks were now separated and split. They were severed, with the worship, the priestly part, essentially being given over to the angel, and Adam was still given the responsibility to till the land, to get fruit from it by the sweat of his brow, until pain and death and suffering would come. But Abel comes along and shows us that in doing that and having fruit that comes from your efforts, you can combine work and worship back together again. Why? Because Abel offers a sacrifice on an altar, which is a priestly function. He combines work and worship back again together by faith. Cain does not do this. Cain goes through the motions with his work, throwing it up there on the altar with no faith whatsoever, and God rejects it. Okay. That's all for Alexander. Another very well-written book. It's relatively short, 200 pages or so. Which brings me to the last one. This is another book from the New Studies in Biblical Theology by IVP, InterVarsity Press. Again, you're going to notice it by its great cover, but this is written by G.K. Beale. I should say that the series editor for all of these is D.A. Carson. I was just checking to see if D.A. did the Old Testament ones too. He did. I don't know what your thoughts are on him. He's been reasonably helpful. I'm not sure where he is at these days, what his stances are on some of the more liberal and woke ideas that have been circulating throughout Christendom. But nevertheless, it is a helpful series overall. And this one by Beale, this is a massive one. This book is like 450 pages. He's got a scaled down version of this too, by the way. I'm not sure if it's published by InterVarsity Press, and I'm not sure if it also falls within the New Studies in Biblical Theology, but I do believe he has a scaled down version of this, probably 200 pages or so, where he just hits the highlights. But the part that I wanted to read again, we've already nailed this with the other ones, but Beale's, I wanted to reference him and kind of introduce the audience to his works. He's helpful, I think. On page 66 of this massive old book here, the heading is The Garden as a Place of the First Priests. Genesis 2:15 says God placed Adam in the garden to cultivate it, i.e. work it, and keep it. The two Hebrew words for cultivate and keep are usually translated serve and guard, or to keep, elsewhere in the Old Testament. It is true that the Hebrew word usually translated cultivate can refer to an agricultural task when used by itself. This is what we talked about already, and that's seen in Genesis 2:5. When, however, these two words, verbal, I'm not going to read those for you, but anyway, occur together in the Old Testament within approximately 15-word range, that means when they're close to each other, they refer to either Israelites serving God and guarding and keeping God's word, approximately 10 times, or to priests who keep the service or in charge of the tabernacle. And then he cites the same ones that we've talked about, right? You got Numbers 3, Numbers 8, Numbers 18, also 1 Chronicles 23:32, and Ezekiel 44:14. This I thought was interesting. He cites the Aramaic translation of Genesis 2:15 to underscore this priestly notion of Adam, saying that he was placed in the garden to toil in the law and to observe its commandments. Language which is strikingly similar to the above Numbers references. Isn't that fascinating? I don't know. I haven't looked into this anymore. I don't know the validity of it, but apparently the Aramaic translation of this. Verse 19 of this Aramaic translation also notes that in naming the animals, Adam used the language of the sanctuary. Later Jewish and early Christian tradition make affirmations consistent with the notion that part of Adam's function was to worship God. The best translation of Adam's task in Genesis 2:15 is to cultivate, that is, work in parentheses, it, and to keep it, that is, the garden. Regardless of the precise translation, however, the preceding observation suggests that the writer of Genesis 2 was portraying Adam against the later portrait of Israel's priests, and that he was the archetypal priest who served in and guarded, or took care of, God's first temple. While it is likely that a large part of Adam's task was to, quote, cultivate and be a gardener as well as guarding the garden, there's both aspects again, that all of his activities are to be understood primarily as priestly activity is suggested not only from the exclusive use of the two words in context of worship elsewhere, but also because the garden was a sanctuary, as we will argue throughout this segment. Quoting Beale here. If this is so, then the manual labor of gardening itself would be priestly activity, since it would be maintaining the upkeep and order of the sanctuary. In other words, using the language that we've been using throughout this episode in episode 3, Adam's work was intertwined with worship, so that when he actually worked, it was a priestly function. Let's see here. Okay, I think that is going to, Beale's going to go on. He's going to basically talk about everything else that we'd already talked about. He also talks about, has a section in here on the garden as a place of the first guardian cherubim, which we just highlighted from Alexander. This is probably where Alexander gets his quote from. But this entire book, this is going to trace that temple motif from the garden all the way to Revelation. And he walks through New Testament books, he walks through Acts, he walks through Old Testament, the Gospels, Hebrews. Fascinating to show how this concept of tabernacle, temple, was ever present throughout all of Scripture. Very good book, very helpful. That's about all for this episode. I just wanted to introduce you to some of these helpful resources that help highlight Adam's work as worship was priestly in function, and also that the garden was a garden temple, or we might even better, more clearly say a temple garden. That is a garden that was attached or adjacent to the temple. So maybe these concepts are new to you. They were to me years ago. It was mind-blowing when I first discovered them, so I just wanted to pass them along, and we will catch you on the next episode.